Hey guys! So, as you probably know, there are two essays that we have to write for the GRE. The first one is the issue essay, and the second is the argument essay. When I first started studying for the GRE, the argument essay was the one that felt like totally brand new to me, like something I hadn't had to do before. And so today we're going to walk through how to handle it, and I have kind of a few steps that I always follow when I am writing the argument essay. So let's go ahead and check it out. The argument essay is sort of the reverse of the issue essay. Instead of crafting our own argument, we're asked to break down an argument and find all of the holes in that argument. Let's start with step one, the intro. Your intro paragraph is very simple. It just needs to be a few sentences, and that first sentence should summarize the argument that's being made in the passage. Then, the next sentence you can write word for word. While the conclusion that blank may be true, this author's argument does not effectively support this conclusion. We need to clarify much of the evidence mentioned in order to make a more educated response. Basically, you're going to always begin your argument essay. In the intro, you're always going to begin it by saying, this is what that argument is. Here's their conclusion that they're making. However, the evidence is not strong enough to actually lead us to this conclusion, and this essay is going to tell you why. So normally, we would want introduction paragraph in a regular essay to be at least 5 sentences long, but in this case it's totally fine for it to just be 2 or 3. Step 2. Okay. Step 2, surveys. Anytime there is a survey used, we can always talk about needing more information to understand how reliable that survey is. So we can ask, how many questions were in the survey? Because if there were many, many questions, and this question was in a small section towards the end, perhaps the people filling out the survey were super tired and needed to get out of there by the time they got to the question that we're dealing with here. Or maybe the survey's wording is such as kind of a leading question. And if it's a leading question and we know that, then that will tell us whether or not we could rely on this survey. Other things that we can think about when it comes to surveys is also who is the sample group that they're asking those questions to. So if, let's say, the argument has to do with a certain town, but the survey only surveys people who live on one street in that town, we can easily talk about how that would make a pretty bad argument, or it would be wrong to take that evidence as proof for an argument that talks about the whole town if the survey only interviewed people on one street. So you can make this paragraph specific to the argument at hand, but there's always room, no matter what the argument essay prompt is, to talk about how they got this information. Who are they interviewing? How many people are they interviewing? What types of survey questions is it? Is the sample size, how many people, is that a good enough number of people that'll be representative of the group? And so I always like to make that my first paragraph, my first body paragraph. Step 3, money or number issues. These things come up very, very frequently in the argument essays as well. Either money, where we're talking about something in the economics or the finances of the conclusion that's being drawn, where we say we need to know more about how this will economically, financially affect the company, because you're saying it's going to improve profits, but do we actually have the evidence to back that up, right? So that's one way this paragraph can go. And sometimes you might have something more like, there are now 40,000 people doing X, Y, and Z in the last year. And so we can talk about, what does that number mean in the context of that group? Is it all of every single person in town who is in that age bracket? Are they all who we're talking about, or is this just a small percentage? And, another example I can think of that's related to this is if we're talking about complaints. There have been complaints to the radio station about this thing. Here's where we would ask, how many complaints? Is it 2 people just constantly calling the station, or is it really just like a really wide range of people? Step 3 can be a little more open. I think most of the time, I would say, there is some kind of financial, economic, money-related thing that you could talk about, because a lot of the arguments are going to be talking about businesses and their decision making. So that would be what I would focus on for the second paragraph.
Step 4, one more hole in the argument.
Ideally, we want to write a 5-paragraph essay if we can. Sometimes just doing your body paragraph number 1 about surveys and your body paragraph number 2 about money might take up all the time, and then you'll skip to step 5, the conclusion, which we'll talk about in a second. But if you do have time, it would be great here to kind of come up with another hole in the argument that you can see. And really, this is what we've been doing all along, but this one's a little more vague. And what you want to do is look at how there's a conclusion. The person is saying, or the argument, whoever it is saying, we should do this thing. That's their conclusion. And the way they get there is what the rest of the argument is usually about. But they might say, we should do this thing because it will increase profits. So in between the conclusion and increasing profits, there's probably a lot of space for you to talk about some other problem or potential problem with this argument, because how do they actually know that it's going to increase profits? And usually there's something faulty in the argument. Otherwise, and by usually I mean always, there's always something faulty in the argument. Otherwise, there's not going to be an essay for you to write. So there's always going to be a hole that you can poke at, and this is where I would do that.
Step 5, conclusion.
Just like usual conclusions, you're going to do a little recap of what you've said. And the most important thing is to, again, talk about how there could be some truth, there could be some validity to this argument that company A should hire company B to do something, right? That could be true. But given all the reasons listed above, we would need a lot more information before we can be on board with this plan. And that's kind of how I always like to end it, is talk about how much information we still need in order to be able to say, yes, this is a great conclusion, or no, this is a horrible conclusion. Either way, we need to know more.
The following appeared in a letter to the editor of the Parkville Daily newspaper. Throughout the country last year, as more and more children below the age of 9 participated in youth league sports, over 40,000 of these young players suffered injuries. When interviewed for a recent study, youth league soccer players in several major cities also reported psychological pressure exerted by coaches and parents to win games. Furthermore, education experts say that long practice sessions for these sports take away time that could be used for academic activities. Since the disadvantages outweigh any advantages, we in Parkville should discontinue organized athletic competition for children under 9.
So we start with our introduction. While the conclusion that Parkville should discontinue organized athletic competition for children under age 9 may be true, this author's argument does not effectively support this conclusion. We need to clarify much of the evidence mentioned in order to make a more educated response. So let's get into the first body paragraph, surveys. We have in the passage, when interviewed for a recent study. That's exactly what I mean by surveys. They're talking to people for a study. And what's interesting here is that they're specifically interviewing youth league soccer players specifically, in several major cities. So right here we have tons of room to write a whole paragraph about surveys because, one, we're only talking about interviews of soccer players. Is the same going to be true for other sports? Is it only soccer players who report psychological pressure from coaches and parents? Or do other people feel that way too? So we need more information about the sports themselves. Next, it says several major cities, but this is about Parkville specifically. So we could easily argue in this paragraph that it's very possible that youth league sports in a town like Parkville is very different from a major city. But we don't know that because they're using a study that's not specific to where we're talking about. It's a study about other places, and those other places are major cities. So it could very well be that the pressures exist in major cities, but they might not exist in smaller towns. So we need to know that in order to know if this is a valid point in the argument. And so, part of my notes here too is how many players did they interview, and is it representative of the whole? Are they enough? Is it enough people? And again, given that we're talking major cities, it's likely that this doesn't translate well to a small town. Plus, the study also says youth league soccer players, but it doesn't say specifically youth league soccer players or sports players who are under the age of 9, which is what the letter to the editor is talking about, kids under the age of 9. So that's another thing we can mention here. Are we talking about 9-year-olds? If we're not, and we only interviewed 10 and up, then perhaps the pressures are just totally different, right? So that gives us a lot to write for the surveys paragraph. Next, let's look at money or number issues. So on the one hand, we want to ask, is this going to have any effect on the economy if we cancel these leagues? Will this affect what people in Parkville can earn and the money that they are making? And then on the other side, the passage is using the fact that in the whole country, more and more children below the age of 9 were participating. Over 40,000 of these young players suffered injuries. So they're bringing us specific numbers, but we're talking about the country as a whole. So again, this doesn't necessarily add up to how it's affecting Parkville. Are there actually more and more young children in Parkville proper that are joining these sports? And we need to know that in order to know, it could be that this is generally a trend in the country, but in Parkville itself, there were only 50 kids under the age of 9 who are participating. So is that enough kids to warrant canceling this thing? Maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe not. So that is something we can talk about in this paragraph. Next, I have 2 additional points that I would point out in my third paragraph, and potentially split these into 2 paragraphs depending on the time that I have. But first of all, it says over 40,000 players suffered injuries. And injuries is extremely vague. We need to know what that means. If this is a real issue, like 40,000 kids or more broke their legs, I mean, that would be something to truly consider. But if it's just most of these kids got scrapes or cuts or paper cuts, that's probably not going to be a strong enough argument to cancel the thing altogether. So that's one thing I would talk about. Maybe that's just a couple of sentences. And then I would also note that in the conclusion sentence, this letter to the editor says, the disadvantages outweigh any advantages. But I think it would be safe to say that we have no discussion of what those advantages might be. And here I would probably come up with some examples off the top of my head of what I think could be an advantage in this situation. And so we would explore those potential advantages before we conclude that the disadvantages clearly outweigh the advantages. I also think we could point out that if these disadvantages are so real, why are we only canceling the leagues for children under 9? Shouldn't we just get rid of sports altogether in Parkville if this is really so horrible? So I think all of this really kind of shows a lot of the problems with this argument. And then we come to our conclusion where, again, we're just going to kind of recap. There's a problem with the interview for the study. There's the issue of how this might affect the economy of the town, and also how does Parkville fit into the country as a whole in terms of number of kids participating in these activities, and we also are concerned about what injuries mean, what advantages there might be versus the disadvantages. If we get all of that information, then we'd be able to have enough information to say, yes, this is a great conclusion, or no, this letter to the editor is not a good idea. We should not cancel these sports. And that is how I would end it. I'm going to put a link in the description to the pool of argument topics. The only argument essay prompts that you'll ever see are from this pool. So it's really useful to do practice just by picking a random one and kind of writing out an outline for it. And I hope that this was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in a comment and subscribe, and we will see you next time.